All right, so get this. We're diving deep today into the EU-Mercosur trade deal.
Oh, yeah, that's fun.
The one that's got everybody talking. Farmers are protesting and politicians are kind of like scrambling, trying to figure out what to do.
Yeah, it's been all over the news.
It's everywhere, and for good reason. This thing could actually change how we eat, what we drive, and even, how power is balanced around the world.
Big implications.
Yeah, huge. And we've got a whole stack of reports here from like all over Europe and South America.
Oh, wow.
So we're really getting the full picture, like from the streets of Paris to the farms of Brazil.
That's really interesting, and it's fascinating because this deal's been kind of brewing for like almost 25 years.
25 years.
Yeah, but now it's suddenly like this urgent must-have thing for the EU.
25 years. They must really be craving that South American beef.
Maybe.
I'm kidding. But no, seriously, what's the rush? All of a sudden, it's not like they just discovered Argentina makes great wine.
Well, there are a few things at play here. First, you've got the whole China situation. They're becoming a major player in South America, snapping up resources and influence. And the EU is starting to feel a little squeezed.
Yeah, a little left out.
And then there's a whole fallout from the war in Ukraine,
All right.
The EU really wants to diversify its trade partners, especially for like crucial stuff like lithium, for those fancy electric cars.
Okay, so we're not just talking about, some boring trade deal here. We got global power plays, electric cars,
Yeah.
maybe even a stake or two on the line. I mean, this is starting to feel like a spy thriller.
A little bit, yeah.
Okay, so before we go full James Bond, though, let's back up a bit. What exactly is Mercosur?
Okay, so Mercosur, it's basically a South American trade bloc made up of Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay.
Got it.
Bolivia is on its way in, and Venezuela is currently benched.
Benched?
Yeah, suspended.
Okay.
It's basically their version of the EU,
Okay.
but with, more tango and empanadas.
Sounds delicious.
Yeah.
All right, so this deal's been in the works forever, and now it's suddenly a top priority. So, what's the official word on it? Is everybody on board?
Well, Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission president, is calling it a win-win.
Okay.
She says it will create this massive free trade zone, boost economies, create jobs.
It sounds pretty rosy.
Right?
But you know what they say, if it sounds too good to be true?
Exactly. There are a lot of folks who aren't buying the hype.
Like, who spilled the tea?
Well, France, for one.
Really?
They're leading the charge against this deal, calling it a betrayal, a stab in the back.
Wow. Strong words.
Yeah. And they're not alone, though. Italy and Poland are also dragging their feet, mostly because they're worried about their farmers getting undercut by cheaper imports.
The age-old battle of, free trade versus protecting your local businesses. It's always a tough one. But wait, isn't Germany usually all about free trade and open markets? Where do they stand on this?
Germany's actually pretty gung-ho about this deal.
Interesting.
They see it as a way to, lessen their reliance on China and open up new markets for their industry, especially the car industry.
Oh.
And remember, they're still dealing with that energy crisis that was triggered by the war in Ukraine. So they're looking for ways to stabilize their economy.
Makes sense. So it's Germany and I think you said Spain on one side, and then France, Italy, and Poland on the other.
Uh-huh.
This is getting juicy, it sounds like, more than just a squabble over like soybeans and sugarcane.
Mm-hmm.
What's the real story here?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
This deal is exposing some serious fault lines within the EU. Some are saying it's even weakening the very foundations of the bloc.
Wow.
And you have to remember, the EU is already dealing with a lot right now. Brexit, the war in Ukraine, and now this potential internal power struggle.
Yeah.
This whole thing is a big test of their unity.
Okay, I'm officially hooked. This is way more than just a trade deal. It's like a political thriller with, economic consequences. But let's zoom in on those farmers for a second.
Okay.
What are they so worried about? We're talking about people's livelihoods here.
Yeah, their concerns are completely valid. I mean, imagine you're a French farmer who's been working hard to meet all of the EU's strict regulations.
Like,
And then suddenly you're competing with farmers from South America who might not have to play by those same rules.
yeah, that doesn't really sound like a level playing field. What sectors are we talking about here?
We're talking beef, poultry, sugar, ethanol, rice.
All the good stuff.
All big industries that are worried about being flooded with cheaper imports from Mercosur countries.
So do they have a point?
They do have a point. European farmers often have higher production costs because of those stricter regulations. It's tough to compete when someone else can produce the same product for less.
So what are these farmers doing about it? Are they just sitting back and watching this all
Oh,
unfold?
absolutely not. We're talking protest, lobbying, the whole 9 yards. They're making their voices heard.
Good for them.
Yeah, they're calling on the EU to reject the deal outright, or at least put in stronger safeguards to protect their interests. They're not going down without a fight.
I can almost hear the tractors rolling through the streets of Brussels. Now, speaking of protests, I know environmental groups are also pretty fired up about this deal. What's their beef, so to speak?
Well, this is where the whole win-win narrative starts to fall apart.
No.
Environmental groups are calling this deal a somber attack on democracy, claiming that it was negotiated in absolute silence.
Wow.
They're worried about increased deforestation in South America as more land is cleared for agriculture to feed those hungry European mouths.
So we've got farmers in Europe worried about their livelihoods, and we've got environmentalists worried about the planet.
Yeah.
Sounds like somebody needs to step in and play referee here.
Yeah.
But isn't the EU claiming this deal has strong environmental protections built in?
They are saying that, but the devil is in the details.
Always.
The deal does include some provisions on sustainable development, but many are saying they're too weak and they won't actually be enforced. Environmental groups are pointing to past trade deals where similar promises were made but ultimately broken. They're not convinced that this time will be any different.
So it's a classic case of trust but verify.
Exactly.
But before we get into the nitty-gritty of environmental regulations, there's one more player we need to address the elephant, or maybe I should say the dragon in the room.
Who's that?
China.
Ah, yes. China. Their shadow looms large over this entire deal.
I bet it does. They've been investing heavily in South America, building ports, roads, and securing access to all kinds of resources. Is this part of the reason why the EU is suddenly so keen on finalizing this Mercosur deal?
If we connect this back to the bigger picture, the EU knows it can't ignore China's growing influence in South America.
Right.
They're worried about being left behind in this scramble for resources and political alliances.
Yeah, FOMO.
In some ways, this trade deal is a way for them to reassert their presence in the region and try to counter China's growing clout.
Wow. This is getting intense. So we've got farmers versus free trade advocates, a divided EU, and China lurking in the background like a Bond villain. What a mess. But before we get lost in all the geopolitical drama, let's break down what happens next. This deal isn't a done deal, is it?
Not even close. This thing still has to go through a gauntlet of approvals, member states, the European Parliament, maybe even national parliaments in some countries.
Oh, wow.
It's a long and winding road.
So von der Leyen might be popping campaign corks, but there's still a lot of ground to cover. What are some of the potential roadblocks we might see along the way?
Well, France, Italy, and Poland could throw a wrench in the works if they decide to vote against it.
They could?
And then you've got public opinion if people are really fired up about this, like those farmers and environmental groups we talked about, that could put pressure on governments to reject the deal.
So it's not just about economics and geopolitics. It's also about people power.
Yeah.
This is getting even more fascinating. I can't wait to see how this all plays out.
It's definitely a situation to keep your eye on. There's a lot more to unpack here, so let's dive a bit deeper, shall we?
Let's do it. Okay, so we've got this high-stakes poker game, with farmers, environmentalists, and global superpowers all vying for a piece of the pie. But let's rewind for a sec. You mentioned this deal has been on the table for ages. Why the sudden urgency? It's not like South America's going anywhere.
True, but the world around them is changing pretty fast.
That's true.
Back in the 90s, when this deal was first floated,
Yeah.
China wasn't the economic powerhouse it is today.
Right.
The EU could afford to be a little bit more relaxed about, securing these kinds of partnerships.
Yeah, take that time.
Now it's a different story.
So it's like they hit the snooze button on this deal and woke up to find China setting up shop in their backyard.
Yeah.
Talk about a rude awakening. But this isn't just about FOMO, right?
Yeah.
What's the EU really hoping to get out of this deal?
They're looking for stability and security, in a world that's becoming increasingly unpredictable.
Okay.
Remember those lithium-powered electric cars we talked about? South America has a ton of lithium, and the EU wants to make sure they have a reliable source for that. And other critical raw materials, they don't want to be caught flat-footed if another global crisis hits.
So it's all about securing those supply chains, makes sense. But I'm guessing this deal is about more than just grabbing resources. How does it fit into the EU's overall strategy for global trade? Are they still the free trade champions they used to be?
Well, the EU has always loved the idea of free trade. They
Right.
see it as a way to boost economies and lift people out of poverty.
Yeah.
But lately, there's been this growing unease about the whole globalization thing. People are starting to wonder if free trade actually benefits everyone, or if it just makes the rich richer and leaves everyone else behind.
Yeah, you can't ignore those farmers protesting in the streets. It feels like there's this disconnect between what the EU wants and what its citizens are feeling.
It's a tough balancing act for the EU. They want to promote free trade, but they also need to address the concerns of those who feel like they're getting the short end of the stick. It's like walking a tightrope.
And if they're not careful, they could end up falling flat on their face. This whole deal seems like a gamble. Do you think it could backfire and actually weaken the EU from the inside?
It's definitely a risk if this deal is seen as prioritizing big business over the needs of everyday people.
Mhm.
It could fuel the populist movements that are already gaining traction across Europe.
Well, that's a good point.
And a lot of those movements are pretty skeptical of the whole EU project to begin with.
Yeah, so this deal could end up feeding the very forces that want to tear the EU apart.
Hmm.
That's ironic considering they're trying to present this united front against China.
Irony is a specialty of the EU, I'm afraid. But let's not forget about the other big concern hanging over this deal, the environmental impact. We were just talking about those environmental groups sounding the alarm bells. Are they overreacting, or is this deal really as bad for the planet as they're making it out to be?
Well, we've got the Amazon rainforest, which is basically the planet's lungs, and this deal could lead to even more deforestation as they clear land to, grow more crops
Mm-hmm.
to ship over to Europe.
You're hitting on a really crucial point that Amazon is just one piece of the puzzle. We're talking about fragile ecosystems all across South America that could be impacted, grasslands, wetlands, the whole shebang. And then there's the issue of pesticides. Mercosur countries often have different standards for pesticide use, and some worry this could lead to more pesticide residues ending up in the food we eat.
Hold on, doesn't the EU have strict rules about that kind of stuff? They're always touting their high food safety standards.
They do have standards, and the deal does include some language about sustainable development and environmental protection, but environmental groups are saying those are just empty words lacking any real teeth. They're worried the EU is basically greenwashing this deal to make it more palatable to the public.
So it's a bit like a used car salesman promising you a fully loaded vehicle when it's really just a clunker with a fresh coat of paint.
That's a pretty good analogy the EU needs to show. Not just tell that they're serious about protecting the environment, otherwise this whole deal could blow up in their face and damage their credibility on climate change and other global issues.
Speaking of global issues, we can't ignore the giant panda. I
Hmm.
mean, dragon in the China. They've been quietly making moves in South America for years, and now the EU seems to be playing catch up. Is this turning into a full-blown geopolitical rivalry?
It's definitely heating up. China has been pouring money into infrastructure projects in South America, building ports, roads, railways, and securing access to resources like oil and minerals. The EU is watching all this with a mix of anxiety and envy. They see this Mercosur deal as a way to try and counter China's growing influence in the region.
So it's like a game of chess, but with billions of dollars and the fate of entire continents at stake. What's China's endgame here? What are they hoping to achieve in South America?
China's approach is pretty pragmatic. They need resources to fuel their economic growth and markets to sell their goods. And South America offers both. They're not as hung up on, democracy or human rights as the EU tends to be for them. It's all about securing those economic and strategic partnerships.
So it's almost like two different visions of globalization clashing, the EU with its focus on values and sustainability, and China with its more hard-nosed, economic-driven approach.
It's a fascinating dynamic, and in the end, it will be the countries of South America who decide which path they want to take. Will they align more closely with the EU's vision of a rules-based international order, or will they be swayed by China's more pragmatic approach?
It's like a tug of war with South America holding the rope.
Right.
But let's bring this back down to earth for a moment. All this talk of geopolitics and global trade is fascinating. But what does it actually mean for, the average person? Will this deal change what we see on supermarket shelves or affect the price of our morning coffee?
It could. If this deal goes through, you might start seeing more South American products in your local supermarket.
Like what?
We're talking beef, poultry, fruits, vegetables, wine, all at potentially lower prices.
Okay, now you're talking my language. Cheaper groceries are always a win in my book, but are there any downsides to this flood of South American goods? What about quality and safety standards?
That's the big question. Some worry that lower prices could come at the expense of quality, and there's always the risk that food safety standards might slip if those environmental regulations aren't enforced. Plus, some argue that cheaper imports could hurt local businesses, leading to job losses in certain sectors.
It's a classic trade-off, cheaper goods versus potential job losses and environmental risks. Not exactly a simple equation. It's going to be interesting to see how this all shakes out. But let's get back to the process for a second. What happens next?
Well, the European Commission has to formally present the deal to the EU Council, which is made up of representatives from each member state.
Okay.
And then the Council has to vote on whether to approve it.
And we already know that France, Italy, and Poland aren't exactly thrilled about this deal. Could they actually block it?
They could try. It's going to be a tough battle for the Commission to win them over. They'll probably try to sweeten the deal with some extra safeguards for sensitive sectors like agriculture, or maybe make some stronger commitments on environmental protection.
So it's a bit like a game of political horse trading. But even if they manage to get past the council, it's not over yet, right? Didn't you mention something about the European Parliament having a say in this as well?
That's right. The Parliament also has to ratify the deal, and there's no guarantee it'll sail through there. Either they could demand further changes or even reject it outright.
So we're talking about a long and potentially bumpy road ahead. This deal could face more twists and turns than a mountain road in the Alps.
Exactly.
Right.
But even if it does manage to clear all those hurdles and eventually get ratified, the real challenge will be implementing it and making sure it actually delivers on all those promises.
Especially those promises about environmental protection and sustainable development. Those are going to be crucial to watch.
Absolutely. And that's where civil society groups, like environmental organizations and labor unions will come into play. They're going to be the watchdogs, making sure the EU and those Mercosur countries actually walk the walk, not just talk the talk.
So this story is far from over. We're just entering a new chapter. And who knows what surprises await us down the road. This is starting to feel like a real nail-biter.
It is. And the stakes are incredibly high. The decisions made in the coming months and years will have a ripple effect across the globe.
This is way more than just a trade deal. It's about shaping the future of South America, the global balance of power, and even what ends up on our dinner plates.
It's a story that reflects all the complexities of our interconnected world, and it's a story that deserves our attention. We'll be keeping a close eye on things as they unfold.
Okay, I think I'm getting whiplash from all these twists and turns.
Yeah.
Farmers, environmentalists, China, global power plays. I mean, this deal's more dramatic than a telenovela.
It is.
But as we wrap up this deep dive, I keep coming back to this idea of two different development models kind of clashing.
Yeah.
It's like the EU and Mercosur, they're coming to the table with completely different playbooks.
Yeah, that's a really sharp observation. You've got the EU, which, despite all its internal squabbles, generally pushes for sustainable development.
Right.
Protecting the environment, promoting social justice, all that good stuff.
And Mercosur, are they not exactly known for being eco-warriors? Are they?
Well, they've got a different set of priorities.
Okay.
For them, economic growth often takes precedence over environmental concerns. And let's be real, they've got a history of deforestation and social inequality that's hard to ignore.
Right.
This deal could either make those problems worse,
Yeah.
or maybe, just maybe, it could help nudge them in a better direction.
So this deal is almost like a litmus test. If the EU is serious about those lofty sustainability goals they need to make sure this isn't just a race to the bottom.
Right.
We want to see the Amazon turned into a giant soy plantation just to feed European demand for cheap burgers.
Exactly. The EU has to use its clout to push for real change. They need to insist on strong environmental protections and work with Mercosur countries to improve their labor standards. It's not just about making a deal, it's about making a difference.
But let's be realistic. Those are some tough asks. You've got powerful industries on both sides that benefit from the status quo.
Yeah.
Do you really think the EU can convince those Mercosur countries to clean up their act?
It won't be easy. There will be pushback, from companies that profit from lax regulations.
Of course.
And from governments that prioritize short-term economic gains over long-term sustainability. But that doesn't mean the EU should just throw up their hands and say, oh, well,
Right.
they need to be willing to play hardball, use those carrots and sticks, offer incentives for good behavior, but also be ready to impose consequences if those environmental and social standards aren't met.
I like the carrots and sticks. It's like potty training for nations.
Yeah.
But seriously, this whole thing hinges on political will. If those EU leaders aren't truly committed to making this deal work, it's going to be a disaster.
Couldn't have said it better myself. This isn't just some technical agreement about tariffs and trade quotas. It's a political decision with huge ramifications, and it's a decision that will have ripple effects far beyond Europe and South America.
Whoa, hold on. I thought we were done with the global power play stuff. Who else is getting dragged into this?
Think about it. If the EU can successfully pull this off, integrate strong environmental and social protections into a major trade deal, it could set a new global standard. Other countries might start thinking, hey, maybe we should be doing that too.
So this could raise the bar for global trade. That's actually pretty inspiring. But what if it goes the other way? What if this deal leads to more deforestation and environmental destruction?
Then it sends a very different message.
Yeah.
It basically tells the world that those things don't really matter when it comes to making a buck.
Right.
And that would be a huge step backward.
It's like we're at a crossroads. This deal could either be a beacon of hope, showing that economic growth and sustainability can go hand in hand, or it could be a cautionary tale, a reminder of the high cost of unchecked globalization. Okay, I'm officially stressed out.
I understand it's a lot to process, but remember, the story isn't over yet. It's still being written, and we all have a role to play in shaping how it ends.
So what's our takeaway for our listeners today? What should they be thinking about after this deep dive into the EU-Mercosur trade deal?
The most important thing is to stay informed and engaged. This is a complex issue, and it's crucial to understand all the different perspectives and the potential consequences. Don't just take the headlines at face value. Dig deeper.
And remember, this isn't a done deal. There are still many twists and turns ahead. Keep an eye on those political developments, those environmental reports, those protests in the streets. Your voice matters.
Exactly. The future of this deal and its impact on the world is still being written. So go out there, ask questions, challenge assumptions, and make your voice heard.
Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about some trade deal. It's about the kind of world we want to live in.
A world where economic growth doesn't come at the expense of the planet or the people. A world where sustainability isn't just a buzzword, but a core value.
And that's a world worth fighting for. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and stay tuned for more explorations into the topics that matter most.